We are being split up by dictators and autocrats, which really shouldn't be the case, but we need to stand there, all 27, and the EU institutions. It's not just one autocratic government and another one, but they really build links, they bundle together, they strengthen each other, they help each other out. We also need to bundle together and become stronger.
Hi, Mrs. Nойман. Thanks for being with us. 75 years ago, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which European countries are also bound. This parliament has constantly been raising the alert for a worsening situation on human rights. You are the vice chair of the parliament's subcommittee on human rights. Could you explain to us how the situation has changed in the past years compared to 75 years ago?
What we have seen 75 years ago was a paramount shift in how the world is being perceived, because before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was a discussion about the rights of states or groups such as armies or the Jews. But for the first time with this declaration, it was the individual human being that was attributed rights. So the idea wasn't that a state has rights or that a certain group has rights, but it's really each and every individual human being. And that was such a major shift. Now they have the right to life to start with, but they also have the right to education, the right to food, the right to political freedom, such as the freedom of expression. So that is what we managed 75 years ago as one of the core learnings of the horrible things that happened during World War II. And since then, more and more states have adopted the concept of human rights, but also more and more people became cognizant of the rights they have and now demand it, for example, vis-à-vis their governments. And these are the struggles we are seeing at the moment. For example, when women and men in Iran demand the right to freedom of expression, when women and girls in Afghanistan ask that they have a right to education, and they demand that from the Taliban, and they demand the international community to support them in this one. And this whole empowering of individuals to ask for their rights, well, that's something that we have seen that is good, but we also see how now, sadly, more and more governments do not feel very comfortable with their citizens asking for these rights and using repressive instruments to stop them.
Parliament mentions a rise on undemocratic or authoritarian regimes in the world. Why would you say it's so?
Well, we see authoritarian regimes to some degree becoming more. So some are shifting that have been more democratic, and now we see more attacks again on civil society. And frankly said, not just globally, but also in the European Union. I have been working a lot with Polish civil society, for example, when it comes to the protection of the Oder River, which is a German-Polish border river. And on this river, there are massive construction works happening that are not good for the health of the river, but also not for the whole region, and it endangers sustainable tourism. And then we have seen about 2 years ago this massive fish kill. So many fishes were dying from river poisoning. And since many years, we are trying to do something against it. And in the beginning, it has been German and Polish organizations doing it together. But then the Polish civil society has been silenced. People visited them in the evening. Some were fired from their jobs. Some had their windows stolen. So that more and more, they were afraid to actually voice their protests and their resistance. And now with the new Polish, hopefully a new Polish government, we have hope that we can do this German-Polish thing again. But this is inside the European Union at the border, but we see that globally. I mean, look at the situation in Afghanistan, where women for 20 years have been fighting for their right for education, for their right to have jobs. And they have advanced so much. We have even seen women ministers. And with the takeover of the Taliban, all of that is gone. And what we see, and this really worries me, is that it's not just one autocratic government and another one, but they really build links, they bundle together, they strengthen each other, they help each other out. So it really becomes a strong force where, well, I'm glad to see that still so many human beings, so many groups, so many states are willing to resist, but we also need to bundle together and become stronger.
We're going to talk more about Afghanistan in a while, but before I wanted to talk more about what's going on in Europe, because besides this issue in the border with Poland and Germany, we are also seeing in some European countries media control, same-sex couples being denied the rights to found a family or to marry even. We're seeing police brutality. How can the European Union ensure that human rights are respected in its own countries? Are there enough mechanisms for that?
We also see that opposition politicians, journalists are spied upon with spyware in at least 5 EU member states. So we see all these threats to very fundamental human rights. And well, inside the European Union, we call it fundamental rights, or not human rights. It's a bit of a language thing, and we have the Fundamental Rights Agency that is tracking, for example, how well member states are implementing the human rights. We have the Rule of Law report, where we assess the Parliament together with the Commission how the rule of law, so all this implementation of fundamental rights basically in the EU member states is taking place. And we often have resolutions in the Parliament where we comment on the situation, where we say the independence of the judiciary is a problem in Hungary, it's a problem in Poland, where we say the freedom of the media is a problem in Malta. It's a problem in Hungary. So we call member states out, and then we have a mechanism of accountability. We saw first sanctions where some of the money that should have gone to Poland, that should have gone to Hungary, was actually withheld. I think we could do more. I think we should do more. We should also be more proactive and stronger to confront countries that are not willing to uphold these fundamental rights of their citizens. But we already have something in place.
And since 2009, European countries are also bound to the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Why was it necessary to have a specific set of human rights parameters for the European Union besides the UN? How does it complement the UN Universal Declaration?
So the UN Universal Declaration is soon to be 75 years old. We have seen new developments since then, for example, in the field of internet, so data protection, citizens' protection, protection of political freedoms in the internet. We have seen that the way we treat our world, how the climate crisis is evolving, actually affects human rights of citizens. So we need to take this whole aspect of environmental rights better into account. And the rights of indigenous groups. So these are things that have developed in the last 75 years and that the EU Charter is trying to take into account. But what may be even more important is that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's not legally binding. So member states can sign up to it and then they commit to it, but it doesn't have concrete effects. You can ask for justice if you have the impression that your rights are violated, that people, institutions, states could be sanctioned. And this is exactly the gap that the EU Charter is filling, because this one, it's legally binding for the EU member states. And what it does in addition, it strengthens the whole pillar of social rights, so that people actually have a right to a healthy environment, education, health services. So all these aspects that are non-legally enshrined in the Universal Declaration, they become much more political, and the right is much more underlined, and there's much more accountability through the EU Charter.
And more recently, the EU has also adopted guidelines to ensure the protection of human rights defenders worldwide. You led Parliament's work on these guidelines. What are the tools that the European Union has to help protecting human rights defenders in other countries?
So human rights and the declaration, these are important documents, but they only change how states work. They only change how we treat each other when there are people who actually implement and defend them. And these are human rights defenders. So frankly said, when we say we want to promote human rights all around the world, human rights defenders are our closest allies. They are the ones who do this in their country, in their community, in their family. And this is why they are often threatened. They are harassed, they are beaten up, they are imprisoned, they are killed. Almost every year there are more than 300 human rights defenders killed. So I think it is crucial that the European Union does everything possible to protect them. It starts with when someone gets imprisoned, we should ask for prison visit. We should ask for their release altogether. We should maybe also have a conditionality on our budget support to third countries. So we say we can only give you budget support if you make sure that the political freedoms of the people in your country are granted. And whenever we know that there is a threat against a human rights defender, it's important that ambassadors, for example, go and visit them so that those who put a threat on them know, well, it's not going to go unnoticed. That we continuously raise this in such things as a human rights dialogue, which we have with a lot of countries. At the moment, we are more reactive. But how can we actually make sure that they are protected in the first place, so that they don't go into prison, so that their family is not harassed? And here I think we have to work much closer with governments that, for example, have our budget support, with governments that we have trade agreements with. We have, for example, human rights clauses in trade agreements. If a country does not comply with its own human rights obligations, I mean, it's not that we force it to them. They are signatories to these charters. They are signatories to these treaties. So if they don't comply, maybe we revoke some trade privileges.
And which other tools are missing for the EU diplomatic service to work on that and to help human rights defenders in other parts of the world?
I'm sometimes a bit frustrated with all the member states, because we have seen that if the EU institutions and all 27 member states, they rally around a claim, they rally around the demand to free a human rights defender, we have a tremendous impact. But far too often, member states leave it to the EU to do the human rights work, and they continue with their business deals or whatsoever. So we are being split up by dictators and autocrats, which really shouldn't be the case, but we need to stand there, all 27, and the EU institutions. The other thing is, human rights work, mostly it's dependent on a third country as counterpart. But there are tools that we have at our disposal where we can decide 100% on how we want to use them. And I find it extremely frustrating that in these cases we don't even do it. So, for example, granting visa to human rights defenders. And in some cases, just having a 5-year multiple entry Schengen visa, for example, would allow human rights defenders to be outspoken in their country, because they can leave at short notice when they come under threat. But they can go back again when they think it's necessary for them to go back. And the other aspect, and this is one of these new things that is really growing, is transnational threats. So even if a human rights defender, let's take a Chinese dissident, manages to come to the European Union, ask for political asylum, and they get it here, it doesn't mean that they are safe. Because the Chinese, for example, also their secret service is working here. They are threatening them here. Sometimes they even disappear. We have the same thing with the Iranian diaspora. We have the same thing with the Syrian diaspora.
And the European Union doesn't have tools to protect them inside the European Union
Well,
itself.
in theory, we have tools. We have our secret service, we have our police, we have our security infrastructure. But they are not enough aware of the situation, and they are not giving enough resources to protect these people, which I really think we need to step it up. And then the third aspect, also highly frustrating, we just spoke about spyware. Sometimes spyware that is either produced in the European Union or that is co-funded by shareholders from the European Union, it goes out to countries where it's used against human rights defenders. And this is really a double standards issue that we need to stop.
Discussing human rights issues, we cannot avoid talking about what's going on right now in Israel, Palestine, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, Iran, Afghanistan, as you mentioned. What is the European Parliament's role on such delicate stances?
Well, I think first of all, our role is to raise awareness about these issues, to be very clear that wherever we see human rights violations around the world, we are not silent. We are having resolutions where we call on member states, but also the EU institutions to be proactive, to also take a stand. And that is something I learned over the last 4 years, how important it is for people whose rights are violated in their own countries. Women in Iran, in their own context, governments would say, oh, it doesn't really exist. No, we are not doing that. It's just a lie. It's like a gaslighting strategy. And if we stand in the European Parliament and we say, no, we see what is happening, we name it as what it is, terror, for example, and we clearly demand consequences, it gives them a lot of strength. But aside of this symbolic thing, it is indeed important that we call on the member states and the EU institutions to take concrete actions. Often we demand for targeted sanctions. So we asked for targeted sanctions against the Wagner Group. It has happened. We asked to terrorize the Revolutionary Guards. This has not happened, but what we are still seeing is a lot of targeted sanctions against members of the Revolutionary Guard. We asked to withhold budget if a government is systematically violating human rights, to withhold budget support. So these things are happening in the parliament, and often they have a consequence.
You've been very active claiming for women's rights in Afghanistan. You've been to the country twice. How is the situation there now for women after the country basically vanished from the headlines?
Frankly said, it's a disaster. Women have been fighting there for 20 years in a very conservative society, so even sometimes against the traditions in their own families, to be able to go to university, to be able to take jobs. And then Taliban took over, and within like a stroke, it was all gone. So right now, they are not allowed to go to school, they are not allowed to go to university, they are banned from a lot of jobs. They are harassed in the streets, they can only travel if they have a mahram, so a male family member going with them. All rights are basically taken away from them, and it limits them to being a housewife in the house and giving birth to children. If you take it out of your free will, it's a perfectly fine life option, but if that is all that you can choose from, it's really a huge problem, and you see many suicides, you see trauma, you see depression.
What could the European Union do more to help women in Afghanistan, women to secure their rights in Afghanistan?
I think it is important that we continue to have this very strong stance towards the Taliban, to say, well, as long as you don't recognize half of your population, we are not going to recognize you as legitimate government of this country. So to be very clear, there's not going to be any normalization with the Taliban. And also in non-bureaucratic and creative ways, because the situation is so drastic, how we can support women that are still trying to stand up to Taliban. So women that organize online teaching because girls can't go to school. Women that want to succeed in the business sector. At the moment, they are not given visa to sell their products at trade fairs here. To support women who run health stations for women. Why can't they get unbureaucratic funding? To help when we see secret schools, to help citizens journalism, so we get proper information from the remote areas in the country. There are a lot of people in Afghanistan who decided to stay, who said, we already picked up the fight with the Taliban once, we are going to do it again. And I think we have to really make sure that we support them also financially with everything we can. And to loosen the very bureaucratic approach that we have at the moment. I mean, imagine a woman running a secret school in Afghanistan. So a school for girls that, of course, is secret because officially you're not allowed to do that. She has to buy gasoline to run the generator. She has to buy paper and books so that the girls can write. If she needs to have a receipt for all of this, every receipt that she brings can help identify someone who supports her, can bring that person to the death penalty. So why do we force these people to still bring receipts for $100? So this is really something where we need to discuss how can we adapt the way we do our funding to the needs on the ground.
Women's rights is also a big problem in Iran, and European Parliament in a few weeks will hand the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought to the movements of Iranian women, and in honor of the memory of Mahsa Amini, the young lady whose death in the hands of the moral police led to the whole uprising in Iran. How do you expect this prize will support this movement for women's rights in Iran?
It is very difficult for people at the moment to demonstrate inside Iran, although the vast majority, more than 80%, want to see this regime gone. So sometimes it is our role in the parliament then to give another platform to these kind of movements, to these kinds of struggles, and I hope this is what we will do in December. And I hope it will also help us to increase the pressure on the European Union External Action Service, because there we clearly have a conflict and a fight, because the Parliament's position is quite clear. We shouldn't enter into negotiation with the regime that terrorizes its own people. It is quite clear that they belong on the terror list, the Revolutionary Guards. It's quite clear that we need to support civil society inside and outside of the country in their struggle against the regime. And it is very clear that we need more visa, especially for those protesters that have been injured, because the regime really shoots into the face of young women just on purpose to make others shy away from protesting. And they should really be able to get proper treatment medical treatment inside the European Union.
And to conclude this interview, could you please explain to us, to people watching this video, what is the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought and how it has helped past winners on their causes?
The Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought is given once a year by the European Parliament to either a movement such as the Women Life Freedom Movement, or to individual human rights defenders? Well, first of all, to recognize the tremendous work they do in the field of human rights, especially in the field of political freedoms, to raise awareness about the specific cause for which they are fighting, but also with this visibility and awareness, just provide protection for them or support them in their struggle. Petras Ostrevicius and me, we have nominated for this year 3 education rights activists from Afghanistan, Maciula Vesa, Masia Amiri, and Parashtu Hakim. They have been, because of their education rights activism, in very difficult situation. Maciula Vesa has been in prison without any reason given. Parashtu Hakim had to flee into exile, but it was difficult for her, for example, to register her NGO and work from here. And Masi Amiri was stuck in transit. And since we did the nomination, just because it raised awareness, Maciula Vesa has been released. I don't know if it was because of the nomination or not, but the nomination clearly sent the signal to the Taliban, we will not forget about him, even if you lock him away. Parashtu Hakim has now all the support she needs to make her NGO work from within Europe. And Masi Amiri finally got her visa to come to Europe so that she can also run her NGO from here and continue to support the girls and the women back in Afghanistan. So these are the little things that we can sometimes do with a prize such as the Sakharov Prize to improve the situations of not just these 3 people. They are the ones who really can change the system. So if we help, for example, one of them to continue run their online courses, it means education to another 4,000 Afghan women and girls who then can play different roles in their families. And it's this butterfly effect. I mean, some of them, they really can change the system and the course of their countries. And I'm so glad that we have this prize and this possibility to support them wherever we can.
That gives some hope. Thank you very much. From the House of European History in Brussels, I'm Marcia Bizzotto, and this is Hana Nойман, the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Human Rights in Parliament.
Thank you for having me.